So, unless you've been living under a rock, perhaps I shouldn't patronize my audience that way, but you're probably well aware of the fact that a lot of folks are talking about this recent ProPublica story, which reveals that Clarence Thomas has taken a large number of, I will call them maybe in-kind donations, gifts, as they say, from a particular billionaire donor, largely in the form of vacation stays and jet travel over the course of a number of years. This has caused politicians like AOC to call for his impeachment and has broadly opened up a conversation about the rightward shift of the Supreme Court and what to do about it. During the trips that have been described in this ProPublica piece include trips along with the architect of the court's rightward movement, the founder of the Federalist Society. So again, this is raising questions about the nature of the Supreme Court, et cetera. So it felt really apropos then to invite on the author of The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, Corey Robin, to have a conversation about what might be driving some of Clarence Thomas's choices here, and what, if anything, we can read into this relationship that he has had with this billionaire. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast, Corey.
Thanks for having me. Really happy to be back.
I should say you're also, of course, the author of Reactionary Mind and a political science professor at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. So I'm very glad to have you with us. So the thesis of this particular book might be surprising to some. It's that Clarence Thomas is, in fact, a Black nationalist. Why do you make that argument? What's the evidence for that?
It's a tricky time to be making that argument. It's got a couple of parts to it. The first is that he has a very strong past as a Black nationalist on the left that influenced him quite a great deal when he was a younger man in college. And that as he made his pilgrimage to the right, he held on to many of the ideas that he had developed while he was a Black nationalist on the left. That is to say, he believes in separate institutions for Black people. He believes that Black people are damaged by the sort of patronage of white elites, white liberal elites. He believes in that the salvation of Black people depends upon heroic, patriarchal, strong Black men. And that he believes that integration and the sort of attempt to bring whites and Blacks together in various social and economic and political institutions not only was a failure, but has been a disaster for Black people. And that Black people truly flourished most when they were separate under Jim Crow, under the kind of leadership of strong Black men. Those ideas are consistent across time for him. And they're also consistent with a kind of conservative Black nationalism or parts of the Black nationalist tradition that he took in as a younger man. And you can see this consistently, not in every single Supreme Court case, but in large swaths of his jurisprudence, not just about race, but about economics and about the Constitution and how we ought to interpret it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I confess, as I was reading your book, kind of tracing the autobiographical trajectory, the experience of a dark-skinned, relatively working class, although, as you point out, in his own kind of racial community and context, his grandfather, who raised him as a business owner, was relatively better off than a lot of other Black people in his environment. However, broadly speaking, compared to his cultural context at Yale and afterward as a lawyer and on the Supreme Court, as a darker skinned man coming from relatively more humble means, being the subject of ridicule by his lighter skinned peers, they called him ABC, which stood for
America. America's
America's
Blackest Child.
right. That you can start to see how he developed a sort of resentment of both white liberal largesse and kind of patronizing Black bourgeois culture. That, frankly, is kind of relatable. I found myself reading this and thinking, am I reading about Clarence Thomas or Adolph Reed at some parts? Because there is this really biting critique of the Black bourgeoisie in particular that I don't disagree with in the least, and which echoes the experiences of, people in, let's say, my mother's generation who attended predominantly Black institutions and saw the kind of class divisions that emerged within those contexts that often get erased in the broader story about how those historically Black institutions are supposed to serve Black communities. And of course, how the people who graduate from those institutions often go into these higher echelons and represent the interests of Black people ostensibly, but often without a class lens. And so the kind of hypocrisy of both white and Black liberals is very relatable. But unlike someone like Adolph Reed, Clarence Thomas does something very different with that critique. And I wonder to what you attribute, maybe describe his shift and why he took a shift from being more explicitly Black nationalist in the traditional sense to being more conservative. And also why you think someone who makes those kind of class critiques, like Adolph Reed and people on the left have made, would go in the direction Clarence Thomas has gone in as opposed to embracing the left?
I think there's a couple of different things going on there. It's a really excellent question because just parenthetically, it's not even just peculiar to Clarence Thomas. There's a whole generation of people who began on the left and developed some similar critiques, some of them Black, some of them white, different groups who made that similar odyssey that he made. And I think many people are always struck by, we all began at the same place. How did you end up here? And not in a simplistic way. I would say there's a couple of things going on there. The first is the Black nationalism that Clarence Thomas was drawn to. Everybody has a very simplistic understanding of Black nationalism, that it's sort of universally left wing. It's a kind of romantic internationalist, Pan-Africanist, revolutionary sort of movement. And the truth is that there are many conservative elements to the Black nationalist tradition going back to the 19th century. And some of those elements, first and foremost, include a whole critique of politics as such. And by politics, I don't just mean electoral politics, which many Black nationalists, including Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, always claimed was the exclusive province of white people, that you're never, as a Black person, going to get any traction. You're never going to get anywhere in a world, in a white state, essentially. So there's a critique of that kind of politics, and there's also a critique of social movements and more kind of grassroots types of politics. And someone like Adolph Reed is first and foremost a political person. He has never, I think he's always, from the 60s onwards, had a very strong political sensibility. Thomas has a very strong pessimism about the possibilities of politics for Black people. He wants Black people essentially to get out of the business of politics altogether. And you could see that in many of his voting rights decisions, where, and you can see it in interviews and essays and so forth that he's written. So there's a critique of politics, I think, is the first thing. The second thing, which is also very strong within Black nationalist, the tradition, is a kind of first embrace and flirtation with capitalism and the marketplace. You see this in some of Malcolm X's writings and speeches. You certainly see it in Marcus Garvey. And when Thomas gets involved in the sort of Black freedom struggle in the late 60s and early 70s, this is a moment right after the peak of the Black freedom struggle. 1968 is sort of the last heroic moment where you see national legislation and all the rest of it. And for many people in the struggle, everything after that is downhill. And for many people in the Black Power movement, for example, there is a very strong interest in forms of Black capitalism, local Black capitalism, Black business, Black ownership, Black patronage, consumption that you see it at the local and grassroots level, and historians have talked about this, and that's the world in which Thomas is operating in. And then I think once you start thinking about that, it doesn't become such a large leap to go from where he began on the left to some much more right wing interest. The Nixon administration in 1972 makes a big deal. They take out ads in places like Essence magazine and Ebony saying black capitalism, or capitalism is black power, or black power is black. I can't remember the order, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
real association with these things, and it's a very cynical move on the part of the Nixon administration, but they are flirting with trying to build black constituencies for the Republican Party. And so that's kind of the milieu out of which Thomas emerges. And then you add to that some of the things you mentioned, the kind of real, just the personal, the visceral feeling of contempt that he experienced from white liberal elites. And he makes the point that, in the South, he was always told that not just he, but he and black people had made it in spite of being black. That was the message he got in the South. Whereas he said in the North, the message was, you made it because you are black. And for him, that was a much, much more corrosive message, because the message in the South was whatever achievements, and they're not just individual, by the way, for Thomas, they are collective black achievements. Those achievements are the province of black. They are authored by black people in the South, whereas in the North, you're sharing authorship, and in fact, not really even sharing it. We're the ones. We white people, we white liberals, are the ones. So I think when you start putting all those pieces together, you can, see where he ends up.
Yeah, what's fascinating is, I mean, you write that he feels like the dignity of achievement is corrupted and essentially undermined by any claim that white liberals in particular might have to having contributed to black success. And to have the reading that something like an affirmative action program does that, kind of undermines this kind of essential dignity, which you write in other places. He claims like everyone has dignity. Dignity is kind of inalienable, and there's this kind of tension between, well, does everybody have dignity that's inalienable, or if a random white liberal supports a program, does it suddenly strip you of all that dignity? But putting that to the side for a second, to buy into that reading requires you not to see Black people and Black liberation struggle as at all part of why white liberals back X, Y, and Z program. And he frames it as white liberal largesse in a way that is arguably ahistorical, and which reads out the contributions of the civil rights movement into any of the gains, as though a bunch of white people woke up one day and said, actually, never mind, Black people are great. And so there's this real tension between, I mean, there are these moments where you describe him as describing the motive of white liberals as protecting the hierarchy of elite institutions, as protecting their access to elitism, as enshrining their own status by protecting these institutions. And that's what diversity is all about, by them being able to say, if we were to diversify by any other means, let's say by getting rid of tests like the SAT that disadvantage Black and brown people, or by, let's say, doing an economic-based admissions process, that would fundamentally hit at the root of the elitism of the institution in and of itself. So the way that liberals launder kind of their own status is to choose a selection process. This is in Clarence Thomas's thinking, that allows them to preserve the hierarchy of the institution while letting in a few Black people that validated on the margins. And when he makes those kinds of arguments, I'm like, yes, this again sounds something like very similar to what the left argues. Why aren't we talking about more class-based admissions policies? Why isn't there more of an attack on legacy admissions? But then the mask starts to slip, because when he's talking about legacy admissions, again, he says, well, maybe that's wrong, but he doesn't see that as insidious or as pointed an attack to the dignity of legacy admits than as he does race-based admissions process, an attack on the integrity of race-based admissions. And it's hard to see that as anything other than his own psychodrama playing out about feeling so marginalized, feeling so like his ego was under such assault when, as he was a Black man that attended Yale, he didn't get the respect that he felt like he deserved. And even on the Supreme Court, his reputation as being an anti-intellectual, his reputation as not speaking during oral arguments, his reputation, the implication that he doesn't write his own opinions, that he's not potentially smart enough to do so, still tracks and follows him and seems to be driving not just his own psychodrama, but the way that he approaches jurisprudence.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in what you're saying there. Just a couple of pieces to pick out, and we can, talk further. I think what he would say on the legacy issue, which you brought up, and that he actually explicitly addresses, and I think his argument there would be that there's a reason why legacy admissions do not undermine the dignity of the children of alums. And that's because there's nothing like racism that would stigmatize and connect their being admitted to Harvard or Yale or wherever to a larger social stigma. And so there, I think his argument is pretty straightforward, that there's something particular and peculiar about racism, right? That no other group in the United States, and he would include Latinos, Asian Americans. I mean, he did this in his famous interview with Juan Williams in, I think, 1987. And, Native Americans, no other group has experienced the kind of the use of racial stigmas the way African Americans have, such that if one person gets in to Harvard, whether they got in under affirmative action or not, one Black person, somehow or another, their achievement is stigmatized as less than because they're connected by a racial logic in white society that the children of alumni are not connected in the same way. And, I don't want to push this too far because, of course, Clarence Thomas, is not arguing, as you point out, for the elimination of class-based hierarchies. But I think there it does follow from a very explicit logic that is both reflective of his own autobiography, but I think also transcends that he thinks there's something specific and peculiar about the experience of Black people and the way racism works for Black people that just doesn't connect other people to other social groups in the same way.
No, I think that you're right. I mean, I think that you're right. Obviously, I'm basing everything I know off of the book that you wrote, but
I like it that way.
But also, I mean, even as you're describing it, him saying that there is something particular doesn't make it so. There have certainly been moments, much more so than the moment we're living in American history, where a stigma around class and being an elite who with unearned wealth was significant enough to drive an enormous social movement that is the basis of so many of our social safety net programs that we live with today. So to the extent that there's a little bit of, I know Barbara Fields and racecraft comes up in the book, it feels like you're right, that Thomas does a kind of racecraft where he is talking some of this stuff into reality in order to validate what seems to me to be, frankly, basically a kind of Afro pessimism. That he like this is I've been thinking as we've been talking. Those graphs that are divided into 4 quadrants, and it's like authoritarianism.
Right.
I'm trying to come up with a graph, the 2x2s. I'm trying to come up with one of those where I want to put, Adolph Reed as a identity politics critic, non-Afro pessimist, Clarence Thomas as a Afro pessimist identity politic critic, someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates as a Afro pessimist without that identity politics critique, and I don't know who goes in the quadrant of
You're so
an
trained as a
optimist.
lawyer, like you like you can think all these things at the same time. I'm just like, wait a minute, I
Well, I
can't follow all this. But
guess
yes, I think
well,
I get
what
the
I'm
point.
getting at is this idea that like, okay, so we talked about what makes someone like Adolf Reed,
Yeah,
despite his similar class critique
yeah,
and racial critique, go off in a different direction. I'm also curious about what makes someone a fellow Afro pessimist or someone who's been described as an Afro pessimist, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who seems to have a view of racism as something close to indelible.
yeah,
Um, Different from Clarence Thomas and their approach to politics.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. There is no doubt that Thomas has a very strong streak of racial pessimism,
Mm-hmm.
Afro pessimism in his thought. I mean, and I think you sort of put your finger on it, which is that he has no political analysis of racism.
Mm.
He has no economic analysis of racism. Racism is almost, it's like part, the phrases you often hear. It's America's DNA. It's the original sin. And he says, I mean, he doesn't use that phraseology, but he says very similar things, like that you can't find the roots of racism. We don't know. Racism will always persist. I mean, it's a view of racism that is removed from the kinds of economic and political institutions that someone like Adolf Reed or Barbara Fields would really be looking at when you want to talk about the reproduction of racial ideology. And as you said, there are moments when that kind of racism recedes in its political impact and its political force under very specific kinds of conditions of multiracial organizing and all the rest of it. Thomas has no, not only has no time, it is completely beyond the realm of his imagination. Like it's very interesting. Like he really does not believe in anything like color blindness, neither as an aspiration nor as a fact. And that really does put him very, very strongly, I think, in the Afro pessimist camp. And I mean, I think uh, the moment of interesting dialogue there is with Afro pessimists on the left who are not just simply in political. I mean, there are some very left-wing Afro pessimists who just are completely in political retreat, and it's a kind of cultivate your own sort of melancholy world. That's not the case with people like Ta-Nehisi Coates or people like that at all.
Mm.
And I think Thomas's question to them would always be, if you really do believe in something like white supremacy systematically woven into every piece of the state apparatus, which Thomas does believe. I mean, it leads him to some strange conclusions, which we can talk about, but he really does believe that. Then tell me, Thomas will say, under under what scenario can you imagine as a Black numerical minority, which Black people are, in anything like a kind of vaguely democratic society, under what scenario could you possibly imagine Black
Yeah.
people getting, forget a fair shake, anything like a shake, that wouldn't at the same time be premised upon the paternalism and goodwill of white liberals, which even you, Afro pessimist, if you want to believe that, you'd have to acknowledge is just contingent and very, very temporary
Well,
and could be turned
that's
around.
what's so fascinating because my critique of Ta-Nehisi Coates has historically been, exactly that. If we are a numerical minority, which of course we will, we are, and that dream that people had of the browning of America that they relied on for like just the last 20, 30 years or so, this idea that enough Latinos were going to immigrate and they were all going to be good voting Democrats, that we were going to be able to put together a racial coalition that made us no longer a numerical minority. Once that's out the window and we see a diversity of political opinion among Latinos, and the numbers just aren't what you think they're going to be, America's still 70% white because, of course, there are white Latinos as well. That the only way that you can expect to have racial progress is by a kind of white largesse. And what I don't want to misrepresent Coates, but what he tends to describe is this kind of project of convincing, of having big conversations, of having racial reckonings. And I don't think he would frame it as white largesse, but ultimately what you're asking for, as you can keep asking, is for exactly that, hoping to convince enough well-meaning liberals that took the right sociology classes that they should vote in your interests that aren't necessarily even their own interests. Whereas I think a lot of leftists would say, well, we have to figure out how to build a different kind of coalition if the racial one isn't going to come into fruition, which means we have to have a class analysis, which means we have to figure out how to stitch together something that isn't reliant on some of these more traditional identity factors that is embraced by liberalism, but something which has been largely ignored by both political parties for a really long time. And it's interesting that for Thomas, he ends up in this Afro-pessimist space because he is unwilling to or disinterested in, for various reasons, and engaging in that kind of a left project of a non-race-based coalition building. And I wonder if you see any indication that there's even an awareness of that as an opportunity, as a way out of that kind of pessimistic viewpoint that he so obviously has.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that closed down for him very early on, sometime in the 1970s when he made this turn. And I think it's why I think in some ways, Clarence Thomas is this, like, it's more than the story of Clarence Thomas. It's a much larger story about a kind of the way in which racial pessimism, which arises for very, very good reasons. It's really hard. I mean, as you know from the Sanders campaign, like, it's really hard to go through a social movement where a people as a whole are giving their all, and really on the gamble, like, we can make this work, and then to have that defeated, not completely defeated, but for many, many people, after, like I said, after 1968, like, that's a real, like, Richard, I mean, it's now been so normalized, Richard Nixon elected, of course, but at that moment, this is supposed to be liberal progressive ascendancy, moving upward and forward. It's not supposed to be going backward. And that experience of defeat is, I hate this word, but I can't think of a single other, politically traumatizing.
Yeah.
And it can send people reeling in a lot of directions. And the thing about Thomas, I mean, ironically, he has such a reputation as a hack and, just a puppet and all these things that you mentioned earlier. The truth about Thomas is that he's an ideologue, and I don't mean that in a bad way. He's somebody who, like, follows every idea to its extreme limit. And I think, as I sort of reconstructed his, journey, to use that silly word, in the 70s, he's looking around and he's like, this leads to a dead end. This leads to a dead end. We're already experimenting with Black capitalism and all of these things, and everybody is saying, like, we've got to figure out a way to progress as a community that doesn't rely upon traditional political means, or perhaps any political means altogether. Well, this is the this is the logical progression, and we add to it something that we've sort of touched on but haven't really brought out very clearly. But the issue of light skin versus dark skinned Black people. Thomas really puts that onto a political matrix. The light-skinned people are Black liberals, and so in the 70s, there's people like Patricia Harris, who was who was part of the cabinet in the Carter administration. She was the secretary of HEW, it was called back then, HUD basically. In the 90s, Drew Days, who was the Solicitor General under Bill Clinton. Thomas sees all of these people, and he feels like, you are really part of, as you say, that Black bourgeoisie, and you're Democrats and you're liberals, and you're aligned with people who are, it's the people who Malcolm X warned us against, basically, white people who seem like they're your friends and they are not, and we are better off working with the people, to the extent that we work with white people at all. I mean, this gets into a whole other thing about himself and the Republican Party, but we are better off with the people who do not smile at you, who are the people who were very clear, where I grew up in Georgia. This is Thomas speaking, not me. Who there was no pretense. Who they were, how they presented themselves as who they were. There was a congruence between surface and depth. And that is a much safer enemy, essentially, to be dealing with than this kind of sort of two-step you get from white liberals. And that really, is a big part of, how he thinks about these things. But it is premised on the indelibility, the permanence of the color line. That this is the way it is.
So for people who haven't read The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, and I strongly recommend that you do, I found it to be incredibly insightful. The outcome of that, the way that this makes sense in the context of his jurisprudence is what? That if you believe that racism isn't going anywhere, then you start to see his, let's say, lack of support for voting rights protections as it doesn't matter anyway. Why are Black people looking to resolve their racial disputes through an electoral avenue? It's not going to work. Therefore, me not upholding whatever voting rights legislation isn't about me trying to get in the way of Black people. It's me acknowledging that this is a futile effort in the first place. Or are there some other examples you can point to help give some context
Sure.
for folks?
Yeah. You've already talked about affirmative action. He, has been, on very much against affirmative action. I would really suggest, and you sort of paraphrase, his opinion in the Grutter decision. We're going to see something like that again in June. It'll be interesting to see what kind of opinion he does or doesn't write. I suspect he will write something because it's an issue close to his heart. So certainly with affirmative action.
Mr. Hinojosa, if this were a Title VI case and there was an allegation of discrimination against the University of North Carolina, who would bear the burden of coming forward?
Is it within the strict scrutiny?
No, just Title VI claim of discrimination.
A normal claim of intentional discrimination,
Exactly.
Your Honor. I would understand that the plaintiff would have that burden to demonstrate.
To come forward initially, but then when the plaintiff makes his or her showing, then what? What's the what's the burden on the accused?
Well, it's not entirely clear from the case law that I'm aware of, Your Honor. Ordinarily,
Is there any case where the court has deferred to the university or to the alleged discriminators' policies?
So, for example, I don't know whether or not this has been answered directly in Title VI case law. Title VII case law, yeah. Your Honor, yes, then the burden would shift to, in that case, it might be the employer.
What's interesting here is I cannot think of another area or another case where the court deferred to the alleged discriminator on something as important as compelling interest. We don't do it in Title VI, we don't do it in Title VII. You have McDonnell Douglas, you have Arlington Heights, and this is a first. And what I'm asking you is, isn't it odd that you have a framework in Grutter that defers on the critical issue in the case of compelling interest?
No, Your Honor. I think it's entirely consistent, with this case, with this court's framework in judging strict scrutiny. Let me make a couple of points first. One is on the discrimination point. This is not discrimination per se. The limited consideration of race in a holistic fashion, as this court has approved, is a limited classification that is subject to strict scrutiny, but that whole strict scrutiny process is trying to filter out whether or not we have a legitimate purpose for this or not, and whether or not there's a compelling interest that may be sought and achieved, through narrowly tailored means.
Let me ask more specifically. If this case involved a school district in Virginia in 1960 that is alleged to be discriminating, would this court defer to its assertion that the races do better if they're segregated?
Absolutely not, Your Honor, but that's not this case. This case is about a limited classification involving a compelling interest.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the court's deference. In that case, the court would put Virginia to the test. In this case, it does not. And I'm asking you why the difference.
In this case, Your Honor, it actually is. The burden is the university has a high burden of demonstrating its compliance with this court's standard under strict scrutiny. The only narrow area that this court's framework, as I understand it, has deferred to the university is establishing its objectives. But the whole framework still requires a well-reasoned explanation for seeking for its own compelling interest. It requires the university to demonstrate that there are no race-neutral alternatives that will work about as well. And so that burden is still heavy on the university to demonstrate compliance with this strict scrutiny framework.
Even more interestingly is his support for effectively segregated educational institutions. And in places like in Mississippi and Missouri, he really has questioned the value of school integration and the integration, in educational, that, Black students do better when they are among other Black students, when, they're not competing against white students. He gave this, he gave this interview in the 90s, which was just, I also recommend people to, it was in Esquire magazine. It was a profile, and he was talking to a Black student who was a senior in Washington, D.C. and was trying to decide where he was going to go to college, the student. And Thomas said, well, where are you thinking of? And the student said, Brown University. And, Thomas stops. And, he's a very friendly, gregarious, kind of upbeat guy, and his person, that's the whole reputation he has. And he gets very, intense and serious. And he says, basically, you want to think twice about that decision. You don't know what's going to happen when you're going to find yourself in an all-white institution and the only Black person or one of a few Black people. You'll see what happens. It can get very, very lonely, I think is the word he uses. And he says, sometimes I feel the same way myself. And it's just an amazing sentence, because he's not saying this in 1975 or 73 when he's at Yale Law School. He's on the goddamn United States Supreme Court, and he still feels that. So that kind of thing, is in a lot of his education jurisprudence, in his voting rights jurisprudence. It's in the Kelo decision about the takings clause, which you as a law student knows, but it's basically to what extent can the government seize property, and he gives a whole story of urban renewal in America, and he said he uses what was the slogan at the time: urban renewal is Black removal. And
quoting Baldwin, right? You said, although he doesn't quote Baldwin, he just quotes him, which is an interesting choice. Yeah,
I know. He cites Eric Foner in his crime and his Second Amendment. So his Second Amendment, that's a whole other area. Gun rights.
But he also justifies on the basis of wanting to have a Black paternal figure able to protect his family. So you're right that he's actually injecting race into a lot of areas of jurisprudence that aren't directly about race, saying that, okay, a takings clause case with Kelo wasn't Black in that case, right? But the person who was reluctant to cede their property so that there could be this urban renewal project. We're saying that, usually these things don't inure to the benefit of Black people, saying that we have to have the Second Amendment rights because we need to have paternal figures able to protect house and homestead. And it is interesting. One, in a world where so much of conservative discourse is about liberals making everything about race, here comes Clarence Thomas quite literally making everything about race, making all of these concurrent opinions that no one else signs on to, but are, he votes along with the conservative majority, but he has his own special race opinion on the side. And in it, he's advocating, in his view, for the interests of Black people. And what's interesting is I remember, talking about Clarence Thomas in the context of law school, and there was always a way that there was this presumption that his opinions on race should be read in bad faith, to the extent that he was, kind of hooking Black folks into one of his arguments, it was done so in bad faith. But I gotta say, my impression from reading this book in the context of the autobiographical piece, I don't know that I can disagree with him on some of these decisions, but I don't know that I am going so far as this to make that same sort of assumption about him, particularly because I think of that cross-burning case in which he was the only the only judge. I think there was it was 8-9.
The only one.
Yeah. Who dissented from a First Amendment case about cross-burning, in which some of the other justices, I think it was O'Connor, who wrote that there was this tradition going back to Ireland or Scotland, something. Scotland, excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to conflate these things, but the tradition going back to Scotland of expressively burning crosses and yada, 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 and like leaving the room open for there to be a non-intimidation purpose in the context of the United States of America, year of our Lord, 1990, whatever it was, that cross-burning was done for other purposes. And Clarence Thomas is like, what are you guys smoking? I grew up in the South. How could you interpret this as anything else? And as you write in the book, you know, or maybe I heard you say this in an interview, it's hard to believe that if that case were heard today, that there wouldn't be more people more aligned with what Clarence Thomas is saying. So if I can accept in that instance that I think there was a really good faith argument for his position,
Right.
I don't know that I could be so quick to close off the possibility that he genuinely believes that there's something to kind of Black separatism. And I gotta say also, this idea that separate and equal needed to be enforced as opposed to integration mandated was not a, fringe conservative point of view at the time. There were many legal scholars who thought, well, that was the way to go. The idea that proximity to whiteness is what's going to cure Black America is pernicious if you see it as simply that. I mean, I'm kind of with Clarence. There's something very patronizing about that. We'll just put a Black kid next to a white kid and like magic things will happen. Now, I don't think that was the actual argument. The argument was, in practice, we have seen the state's unwillingness to actually equally fund Black institutions. Therefore, the only workaround is to give Black people access to white institutions and force white institutions to accept Black students. And Clarence Thomas, again, doesn't seem to reckon with the reality, the pragmatic concerns that people are dealing with on the ground. And the fact that, the world that he imagines where, well, we just need to equally fund Black institutions. We just need to let the Black institutions have their own shot. And my position at the EEOC, I'm going to protect Black HBCUs, historically Black institutions, from integration because the value of these institutions. I mean, that's a wonderful objective. I'm glad that he did it. But there's also these realities on the ground of Black institutions not having adequate funding and failing in really demonstrable ways today. And that seems to be the issue, not an issue of good faith or bad faith. I mean, how do you feel about it as the expert here?
I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Like, I mean, I think, I hate to say this because I know the name of your podcast is Bad Faith, but I think we have a weird obsession with good faith and bad faith, to be honest with you, in this country. And, as if like, if you can prove the sincerity of somebody's position and the purity of the origin of their position, somehow that gets cleansed of all that's problematic about their position. Thomas is a true believer. He's an ideologue. To my mind, that doesn't elevate him. That doesn't redeem him. That doesn't make him in any way somebody who should be less opposed. I think if anything, I feel like if somebody is in bad faith, like we're better, you're better off with them because then you can always somehow manipulate them and kind of back to a, better position. They're grounded in reality. He is in many ways a fantasist and a very dangerous one. And precisely for the reasons that you're talking about, that, he really doesn't reckon with certain realities. I wouldn't even say they're pragmatic realities. They are, systemic realities that I think lead to very different conclusions. But I think you're right about it. Just one other quick thing parenthetically, because when you were saying about the Brown decision and integration, Thomas reviewed Derek Bell's book. I don't know if it was Faces at the Bottom of the Well. It was in 1988, 1987, and he reviewed it in the Wall Street Journal. Very positive review.
Hmm.
Derek Bell. And that, really shows you kind of where his thinking somewhat aligns with, people on the kind of more Afro-pessimist left. Yeah,
Hmm.
sorry.
No, I think that's all. I mean, I think he's a fascinating man. But this point that you just made about bad faith, good faith, as much as I think I agree with you that there is an obsession, I got to say, especially among kind of liberal political spaces with bad faith in particular, proving Republicans are in bad faith. Clarence Thomas himself seems to have some regard for that idea, insofar as he really values the good faith honesty of Southern racism as compared to the cloak and dagger racism that he experienced in the North. And I think that brings us kind of nicely to what's going on in the contemporary context with him, where there does seem to be this weird gap between the critique that he has made of elites, the critique that he has made of white Northern liberals, or white Northerners generally speaking, his kind of oh shucks pantomime of having these working class roots. He's interviewed as preferring to hang out in Walmart parking lots and do pedestrian everyman things. And this revelation now that he's spent his summers on chartered planes, 162-foot yachts, trips that exceeded the value of $500,000, all paid for by real estate magnate and Republican mega donor Harlan Crow. What do you make of all of this?
You forgot to mention the real gift, which was the $1,200 in tires from a businessman in Omaha. Which somebody said, does he drive sports cars? And the truth is he does. He drives a Corvette that's like 1957 Corvette that's extremely expensive. So it's like it has a kind of all-American cachet, but it's also, a shitload of money. So this is, as I said at the beginning, it's sort of a tough time to defend the good faith of Clarence Thomas. But I'm gonna take a try on this one, actually. Really dig myself in deep here, into a hole. But couple of things. So in 1987, Thomas gives this speech at the Pacific Research Institute, which is like a libertarian outfit out in San Francisco. And it's a really important speech that I use and track throughout a lot of his decisions about campaign finance, which maybe we can talk about some more, where he says the real problem, and this is has both a racial and a kind of non-racial context. I'm going to talk about the latter here. The real culture war between the left and the right is about money. And remember, he's talking about the kind of John Kenneth Galbraith liberal, the sort of 1950s, 1960s liberal, not the people we think of as liberals today, but the sort of New Deal, Great Society kind of liberal. And these are people, he says, who just have this real hostility to money making, to people who have money, to people who make money. And instead, they believe in what he calls the idealistic professions. Academia, journalism, the law.
I've got two out of the three. I'm just waiting for my professorship to come
in. People, and he says, people who make their living by producing words. These are speech-based people, let's say. And in contrast to that, he says, businessmen are viewed as venal and dirty, just material, crass. And, again, this is like, I hate that phrase culture war because it implies that everything about economics is just economics and doesn't have a cultural valence. But for the right, and it used to be for the left, there was a real cultural, a moral valence. Like money was dirty for the left, basically, I'm being very simplistic here. And for the right, the project of the right was to rehabilitate the status of money, to make money moral. And it found expression in the battle over the First Amendment. So, for liberals, the First Amendment is freedom of speech. It's the palladium of liberty, right? That's, who we are as beings is, what our beliefs, our speech, our association, our expression, all of these things. Like, it's most important to protect that. And Thomas and the right wanted to do the same thing, but for money. They wanted to make money making have that same vital, self-expressive standard. And there's a whole race component to this too, which we can talk about. But I really do think this is, central to Thomas's and the right's moral vision. And so we could talk also about campaign finance in a second, but jump forward to this moment here. And I'm not defending Thomas, but I think in his mind, it's like, let's look at all the trips that the liberals take, some of which are mentioned, some of which are not. They're all funded by universities and law societies. You go to Rome for the summer and you teach a course and whatever, and you get this whole trip. And for him, I do think it's this kind of like fundamental culture war that you liberals see money like as having a taint. And you don't see all of these other activities as having the same kind of taint. And the irony is, like, this isn't a secret with Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
If you read his campaign finance jurisprudence, it is just there, loud and clear in a series of cases over the 1990s and the aughts, where he basically what it comes down to, and the issue is campaign donations, right? And he says, like, what are you doing when you donate money to a campaign? Like when I gave money to Bernie Sanders, let's say, I am expressing a belief. Mm-hmm. I am seeking to influence the political process, right? And, politics and beliefs do not happen outside a material medium. They require money, it's how it's done. And what a businessman, and he says like, especially in politics, it's expensive. And oftentimes it'll be the man of means who is funding these causes. And unless you liberals want to go a route that you've refused to go down, which is not just to say restrictions on donations and expenditures, but it has to be equal, right? That everybody has to spend an equal amount, which nobody on the liberal side of the court ever was really willing to go down that path. Then you have to accept that there are going to be people with different means who seek to speak through the political process, and will have a differential effect on the outcome. And it's just like, and that is fine. That is citizenship. That's democracy. And he is very upfront about this. Now, of course, he's talking about the political process, not judges, but nevertheless, I think the same thing.
Right. So, I mean, first and foremost, you have to say that, there is there's one level of discourse out there right now where people are arguing whether or not it's fair to say every mention of George Soros is anti-Semitic, because, of course, Democrats have their billionaire donors, Republicans have their billionaire donors. And there is a kind of, there has been a stigma that liberals have attached to conservative donors while ignoring some of the negative influences that come along with having left-leaning but billionaire patronship at the same time. And I think that's a fine critique. Fine. Of course, the left feels differently. The left is more willing to say, yes, nobody should be taking from these kinds of sources. There needs to be much more robust campaign finance reform. But specifically, just now you're pointing to the fact that there was this decision that said it would be an abridgment of speech rights to say that everyone had to have the exact same cap on the exact same contribution in the political campaign context. That everyone has $5 and that's all you can spend. That would be an abridgment of speech rights. I don't know how I feel about that, but that's the law. Right. And so what Thomas's view, this is what you write. You write, liberal critics will claim that Thomas's model is pure influence peddling, money buying access and legislation, the essence of corruption. Thomas counters that corruption happens only if there is a simple quid pro quo, a bribe, which is illegal. Influence and access, by contrast, are what all citizens seek. Influence peddling, in other words, is the essence of citizenship. So, but for looking at it through that lens, it's difficult to how is he perceiving what he's doing right now, sitting under giant Native American statues with the architect of the Federalist Society and going on yacht trips? At what point, if you acknowledge on some level that there is a thing called a bribe, that there is a kind of quid pro quo, is the implication here that Thomas thinks that but for me explicitly asking you, hey, do this for me because I gave you this boat trip, there can be no such thing as influence, or that influence itself is patriotic and there isn't anything wrong with it unless it's like explicitly demanded?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much right. And, the truth of the matter is, for the most part, and all political scientists argue about this a lot, actually, like under what conditions, does money influence politics? And I think the general consensus among political scientists is this, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that like has to do with other things, and Thomas is an ideologue. He would be ruling this way under most circumstances anyway. And then there's this, like, there's some very specific rules type thing that one business group or, operation really, really wants. And that's where, the money factor really becomes important. But there's a huge part of it that really, it's just like Thomas would rule this way no matter what. But I think you're right, though, that he really does. It's like he says, you quoted stuff about the bribes and quid pro quos, and he says, the problem with these models of corruption is that they posit this kind of, that corruption is basically anything that's not pure. And so anything that's not some kind of pristine Habermasian speech, situation where we're all just discoursing, right, becomes impure. And that's just, for him, that's just not the way it works. And anything outside of that, as long as it's not a bribe, which is illegal and, is taken care of, that's that. It does. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
It does get him into this, obvious situation where the optics, as they say, are really, really bad. But in a way, I mean, this is what's I find so difficult about, not difficult, kind of grotesque about Thomas, is that, you think you got him there, but he's already written that, if this is your model of optics, that you basically precluded a whole swath of, political activity that most people would accept as normal. And, he doesn't give a shit.
Yeah, he's already admitted that he doesn't care. I mean, that's the thing about this, is that this isn't a gotcha. In decisions he's already written, he's argued this. You're right. He wrote in McConnell v. Federal Election Commission, a 2003 case, justifying or defending what the left calls out as one of the biggest problems in our political system, which is that the very, very rich have an outsized say in our democracy. He says, the only effect, however, that the immense aggregations of wealth will have in the context of independent expenditures on an election is that they might be used to fund communications to convince voters to select certain candidates over others. In other words, the coercive and distorting effects are that corporations, on behalf of their shareholders, will be able to convince voters of the correctness of their ideas. Yeah, that's a problem. He goes on. Apparently, winning in the marketplace of ideas is no longer a sign that the ultimate good has been reached by free trade in ideas, or that the speaker has survived the best test of truth by having the thought get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Now it's evidence of corruption. This inclusion is antithetical to everything, yes, for which the First Amendment stands. So wait a minute. He's fully just describing corruption. He's fully describing the fact that corporations can use their outsized wealth to have more of a say in the democratic process than any individual person. Basically saying the concept of one man, one vote, who cares? Everyone should be trying to convince as many people as possible. And he pretends, he frames persuasion in this case as necessarily the winning out of a superior idea, as though people have perfect information, as though there's no such thing as lying, As
Right.
there's no such thing as suggestibility, as if someone doesn't hear the same message over and over and over again because they're being subjected to advertising, that they're not likely to just believe something as truth or follow the lead of someone who they believe to be authoritative and who they like for other reasons. Like, I don't know, a trusted actor from the 1950s who becomes a president in the 1980s. You know, like these
Right.
things don't happen. And
Right.
so is he deeply naive when he writes something like that, where he thinks that that advertising is only good, that if I'm persuaded to buy Cheerios or cigarettes or whatever it comes on the TV, it must be because that's the right thing for me, as opposed to that I was just persuaded by
Oh,
corporate dollars?
no, it's interesting you mentioned advertising because now you're in the whole realm of commercial speech, which has
Mm-hmm.
been a huge issue on the court. And just, for the listeners who don't know, you know, speech up until the 1970s was considered to be what we're doing here, speech. And it always precluded anything having to do with commerce. So advertising was never protected as a First Amendment kind of activity. In the 70s, it begins to be protected, and liberals start buying into this idea that advertising is a form of speech. And Thomas will say in that context that's not that they are trying to persuade you. Of course, that's what they're doing. That's what corporations are trying to do. They're trying to use communicative means in all their, image, wordplay, manipulate, all that stuff. So he is absolutely embraces that is, that is what's happening in those speech situations, and that that it is as you describe it. But I think this issue with the campaign finance stuff really, I think it's both naivete and also being an ideologue, as I said earlier, that he begins with this idea that money is speech, and which is not an idea that he or the Roberts Court invented. You see that in the original Buckley v. Vallejo decision, which was authored, most people think, by Justice Brennan. That when a campaign spends money, that is a communicative action, essentially, because a campaign cannot just speak without a medium. You need to rent a loudspeaker. You need to get things that cost money in order to transmit your message. And so that's where he starts, and then he just runs with it all the way to the very, very end. And whereas the liberal court said, okay, we're not going to put limits on campaign expenditures, but we are going to put limits on donations because we don't want that taint of corruption in democracy. He says, nope, I'm going to take this idea and I'm going to go all the way to the end. And it ends up in something, it is both, as you say, it is both naive in the extreme and also ideological in the extreme.
Well, you're right that there's this insight that if you can wrap whatever your political agenda is or your political value in rights-based language, if you can take something like speech that is considered to be kind of uniquely inviolable, unlike certain other kinds of protections, then suddenly it's hands off for the federal government and more leniency for corporations to do whatever it is they want. So that if suddenly firing someone is an expression of speech, then bye-bye labor law.
Yeah.
So to
and
what
this
extent?
Is where
Please.
This is where this is where not only Thomas, but I think a lot of the conservative court is going. And in fact, Justice Kagan pointed this out in her dissent in the wedding cake case in Colorado. She says the First Amendment is being weaponized, and an increasing amount of activity. And it started with advertising in the 70s, but it's slowly branching out to more and more areas, is being redescribed as a form of communicative speech. And once you do that, then it becomes subject to the First Amendment's protections, and the barrier to federal regulation that you have to jump in order to justify it becomes very, very high. And this has been a right-wing project, as I said, since the 70s. And you oftentimes hear on the left that the right wants to revive the Lochner decision, which was about the 14th Amendment or the right of contract. But that's not where the right has gone. Where they've really gone, and you saw it in that wedding cake case. And Thomas and Gorsuch, by the way, were really interesting on that case, because the there were, five conservatives who voted against in favor of the bake shop owners, and three of them did it on religious freedom grounds. Thomas and Gorsuch did it on free speech grounds, that it wasn't just about a religious thing. It was that the wedding cake maker and making a cake is engaging in an expressive form of activity. In the same way that, if you're an artist, and drawing something, that's a form of an activity. And the fact that it gets sold in the marketplace does not make it any less art than the fact that that wedding cake is being sold in the marketplace. And so, that's the way they're going. And they're doing this about, as you said, ultimately you can see how this would go into labor law. There's a long history there, in fact, which we don't need to get into, but a lot of left-wing scholars in the academy have pointed out to in the 40s and 50s that, the way the right started pushing back on labor law and labor protections was by using things like First Amendment for newspapers and religion to really start limiting the protections of labor law. And that goes back to the 1940s. So there's a really troubling history. And, if I could just say one more thing about this, part of what irritates me about the kind of circus atmosphere where it's like the trips that Thomas is getting, and now we're on to the art that the guy who funds the trips is, is it really overlooks the real depth of the problem with the rights control over the courts and how far they're going. That has, that to my mind makes whatever quid pro quo there may be in these cases, and with Thomas, I suspect there's very little, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
That's just such the surface of the problem, and we really get distracted by this kind of circus sort of discussion. Not that it's not fair. It is clownish and it is circus-like and it is extreme, but this stuff that we're talking about right now is extreme. But and maybe clownish, but it's not circus-like. It's really a very deep kind of jurisprudence that they've been developing here.
Yeah, I frankly am kind of surprised that this ProPublica story has made as many waves as it has. I'm surprised and I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because this is exactly the kind of story that I think kind of a mainstream liberal media very much enjoys. There is the perception of corruption and impropriety without it being something that really goes to especially deep systemic issues like the jurisprudence that we're talking about here. It is like bad optics. It's the kind of thing that you can critique without worrying that your own guy is going to get touched by friendly fire. Yeah. Although now we know that Hakeem Jeffries has attended an event, at least at this billionaire guy's house. So it's a big club. You're not in it, et cetera, et cetera. But I wonder what you make of now this being used as a hinge for, say, AOC calling for the impeachment of Clarence Thomas. Of all of the things that we know that these people have done, of all of the decisions over all of the years, of the Roe of it all, the Dobbs of it all, what do you make of these kind of calls from AOC in this moment?
Quote, early in my tenure at the court, I sought guidance from my colleagues and others in the judiciary and was advised that this sort of personal hospitality from close personal friends who did not have business before the court was not reportable, rather. What is your response?
I think that his own statement contradicts many of the facts on the ground and also raises in other ways even more serious questions. Later on in his statement, he stated that the reason and the rationale for this exemption was personal hospitality from an old friend. And he said himself in his statement, a friend of 25 years. Justice Thomas has been on the court for 30 years. And so to say what he is admitting in his statement in an attempt to defend himself is that he began this relationship with a billionaire and receiving these sorts of gifts after he was appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. I think that in and of itself indicates a very, very serious problem. And then on top of that, he is now implicating his colleagues. And I do believe that Chief Justice John Roberts must now come forward and state if he allows and is allowing this kind of very serious corruption to happen on this court. I think, when it comes to Justice Thomas's statement, when he's talking about his colleagues and when he's talking about who advised him to break the law, I think we need to know who those people are.
I mean, I guess what I would say is, there's nothing wrong with taking a good salacious story that is used as a window on a much more systemic problem. That's good politics. Anybody would do something like that. And so if this were viewed as a way in to reveal a much bigger problem, which I think some people I've seen, in social media have been doing, this is a problem not just of Thomas, and it's not even just a problem of corruption and elite corruption. This is a much more systemic problem about the court and the role of the court and who the court now represents in America's political system. All that stuff I think is great. And I think using a story like this as a window onto that is great. What I fear about some of the discussion and including that, some of the stuff about, impeachment and such is that it doesn't do that. It doesn't become a window. And this is, in a way, this has been the problem with the whole impeachment tool in the last couple of years. I mean, you had Trump impeached twice. And I remember, thinking about this at the time, in the past, impeachment battles, with presidents and even some justices, have really, they've been ways of opening up much more systemic problems. And now it seems like it's been lawyered down into very narrow sorts of issues. And so that, the kind of things, the problems of Thomas, for whom they're there's tremendous evidence that he committed perjury during his testimony and there's all kinds of things going way back. Now it gets narrowed down into, I don't know, almost like a cartoon villain. So, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of story. And again, I want to be really careful and clear here. If the story were to use to open up things, that's great. And I'm all in favor of it. But when it gets narrowed down and focused, on Thomas and not just on Thomas, but this really kind of egregious form of behavior, I feel like it's sort of a lost opportunity.
Also the violation, to be clear, I mean, it is very poor form, but there are not very many laws that are actually, there are not many ethics rules that guide Supreme Court justice behavior. There are some some Federal Circuit Court judge rules that they look to in an advisory manner. But my understanding is that outside of the fact that he was supposed to have disclosed the travel, in particular, so the boat trips and the plane trips are what's under most scrutiny right now. That's where it seems he most clearly violated the obligation. And he did once disclose one of these trips, which suggests that he at some point knew that it was something that he should have done. But apart from that failure to disclose, there's not much there. So there's a world where he is telling the world, hey, I'm going on this $500,000 yacht trip. We all are like, okay. And there's nothing we can do about it. And nothing really changes, right?
And this came up in 2004 or 5, I can't remember, with Scalia, who got a trip on Air Force Two with Dick Cheney while a case with, the Cheney-Bush administration was right before the court. And this exact issue was brought up. And, it was, again, his trip was paid for by the people who were litigating a case before the court at that very moment. And he basically just said, fuck you. And, that was the end of it. Now, you got to be careful here, because just because a whole pattern of corruption has been tolerated and allowed to build up doesn't mean you never then deal with it when it comes up. And I think the best reporting has really opened this up, that it's not particular to Thomas. It's a much more systemic problem, and all the things that you say. But there still is the fact that it's just sort of, I don't, it's Richard Hofstadter had this line, the American historian, about anti-Catholicism in the 19th century, and he said it was like the pornography of the American Puritan middle class. Like, they could look at all these practices in the Catholic Church, which at the time was considered, a totally rearguard, revanchist institution, and indulge in their own like pornographic imagination. And I just get a little dispirited watching some of the discussion, like ever more, obscure, works of art by, this one and that one, and then parsing the meaning of this, whatever. And it's fine, but it does get us a little bit.
Oh, you mean the whole Nazi artifact discourse, which has taken over my entire timeline. Yeah,
like the last 36 hours, and now everybody's a hermeneuticist of Nazi art and all the rest of it, and
For people who don't know, but again, sorry, billionaire is known to have a rather extensive Nazi artifact collection, including a signed copy of Mein Kampf, and now there's discourse about whether or not you can have Nazi artifacts because you want to remember World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, and not because you like Nazis. And people have said he has artifacts from all kinds of other political backgrounds that he obviously doesn't subscribe to, including left political figures. He gave Clarence Thomas a $19,000 signed copy of the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. So it's all over the Bible that he had. Okay, yeah, sure, right. That makes more sense. So I mean, it's all over the place. So, but again, it's kind of not the point. So now we're having a conversation about whether or not owning Nazi napkins makes you a Nazi, instead of this really substantive conversation that I will say I want to give Sheldon Whitehouse, some credit for, because he's been really pushing this move to talk more about all of the pro-corporate cases before the Supreme Court, and looking at all the 5-4 conservative-leaning decisions over the last 30 years or so, and observing that while we talk so much about the cultural cases and the cakes and all of the things that are obviously very important, that the real driving force of this conservative majority, the reason why all of these billionaires have put so much money into the Federalist Society and the like, the reason why it's so important that, as you write, Clarence Thomas has more clerks in the federal courts as judges and has more influence in the federal court system than any other judge in the history of judges, is because of the way that they are determining financial cases.
My contention, and I think Blackstone's and others, is that a jury is not just a fact-finding appendage of a trial judge, but actually is an important piece of America's architecture of governance and should be treated as such. And I also often note that the Supreme Court seems to have gone on a binge of trying to diminish and deprecate the civil jury, which, if my thesis is correct, that the Supreme Court has largely been captured by big corporate special interests, would be consistent with trying to undermine the civil jury, because you don't really want a institution that pushes back against the more wealthy and powerful members of society, who are today corporate members of society, if you're in tow to those corporate members of society.
And that if perhaps liberals and Democrats focused more on that, they could get more independent and conservative-leaning voters not to be so invested in some of the culture war aspects of the Supreme Court, and realize that it's really acting very strongly against their economic interests. But that's a whole other kit and caboodle. Corey, I really so appreciate you joining me today. Can you let people know where they can find your books and find you and any other writings you're doing on the internet?
Yeah, so the book is The Enigma of Clarence Thomas. You can get it at any bookstore or any, large non-corporate website that sells books. And I have a website, corey.robin.com, where you can see other writing that I do. And I really enjoyed talking about this. And we'll talk again sometime.
Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun for me. I love doing a good close reading session. And again, it was a great book. There's so much we didn't get to, so please do pick it up. Thank you, of course, for listening to this episode, this free episode of Bad Faith Podcast. You know, you can get an additional episode every week at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. They drop every Monday, and you will also have access, obviously, to well over 100 backlogged premium episodes, video and audio included. Really appreciate you supporting independent media. Yada, yada, yada. You know the spiel. Thank you. I'll see you later tonight on Call-In. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.